Welcome to Ace of Pentacles, your career strategy and workplace wellness podcast. I'm your host, Sara, and I'm so happy you're here. Join me every week as we investigate how people design and discover their way through their careers. Together, we'll explore the science of well-being at work and discover tools and strategies to help us do well and be well. Dr. Swan Dao, welcome to Ace of Pentacles.
Thank you, Sarah. Very pleased to be here.
I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you. We're going to be talking about communication today, about boundaries, consent, conflict. You are an incredibly talented and well-rounded professional from what I've gotten to learn about you. And so I'm excited to share that with the audience today.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. So Dr. Dao, let's start with your story. Can you take us back to an early experience that shaped your understanding of communication or conflict? What drew you to explore these different themes in such depth over the years?
Certainly. I think my childhood was filled with moments of violence and silence, unwanted silence, and not really knowing how to connect with my peers. I'm an only child. Also didn't have cousins and not a whole lot of children around me. So it was a rather lonely childhood. There was the urge, the desire, and the basic need to connect. And my parents were rather harsh, and communication wasn't always easy with them. I'm part Asian, and in some Asian cultures, and also more traditionally, you don't really question your parents. So you just have to say yes to everything. And I wasn't too happy with that at the time. And so that really formed my relationship with communication. Another important experience, it was philosophy, which is what I first studied at university. And there, in a way, I thought I found an answer because it was all about clarity. I studied analytic philosophy, and you need to be extremely logical, concise, precise with your arguments. And we're a very intellectual culture, so in a way I thought that was the answer. So long as I'm clear and concise and precise, people will understand me and everything will go smoothly. I later realized it wasn't quite the case. And although we can reason and we're rational beings, that's only part of the story. And actually we're much more emotional beings. And we use our reptilian brain a lot more. And I realized that later on studying psychology and all sorts of things and just being, using common sense a little more about how we navigate the world. And so, yes, reason, logic wasn't enough. And I trained in a number of practices from nonviolent communication to circling. And it made me realize that the two main things, I believe, that people shy away from when it comes to communication is vulnerability and conflict. So that's part of the story. And having been raised in an environment where there was a lot of conflict, but it wasn't really addressed in a healthy way. And I think at some point I'd shut down and I couldn't allow myself to be vulnerable because I was too afraid. And so having learned to approach conflict in a different way, to see it in a different light, and also to see vulnerability as strength, like Brené Brown and many others would say, completely transformed my way of communicating and of relating to others.
Well, what you just shared reminded me of a quote that I came across not too long ago. We teach best what we most need to learn. I don't know who that comes from, but your story is there's so much connection there with that quote. I think it's so relevant, I think, to your story. What an incredible start to your journey. I want to talk a little bit about, you've trained across many disciplines, and I want to help our audience connect the dots between this experience of your childhood and growing up in an environment where it wasn't always safe, maybe, to speak up, right? And then you chose to pursue philosophy and theater and psychology. Can you help tell that story to help us understand what were those turning points? What were those moments in your story where you were like, oh, that's the thing I need to learn now, and that's the thing I need to learn now, and all leading up to where you are now? And what you do.
I think the journey could be summed up as a series of illusions, trying to move away from the illusion and being disillusioned at some point with what I discovered. So moments of growth, of flourishing, of discovery, and at some point seeing the limitations, the shortcomings of what I had discovered. And I suppose that's why I've journeyed quite a bit, so to speak, and explored a number of fields and disciplines. So briefly, in a nutshell, I started out, as I mentioned, philosophy. I specialized in moral philosophy. And then I discovered theology and comparative religion, and I went to seminary. I originally wanted to become a priest, but I was hesitating between being a monk and a priest, which is quite rare for a 20-year-old these days. Maybe not as much in the United States, but in other parts of secular Europe, it was quite rare. And I was seeking greater understanding. I was trying to understand, like a scientist does, to better understand the world, and to also reconnect with those dimensions of existence that people oftentimes overlook, call that sort of more introspective knowledge, inner wisdom, ancient traditions, what some call spirituality, which is nothing too esoteric for me. It's simply better understanding reality. The greatest scientist is bound to be a spiritual person, in my opinion, because they're really trying to understand what's out there, but also what's in here. So there's really no divide between the spiritual quest, if you may call it that, and the scientific quest. It's about seeking greater understanding. But what we do in our society is oftentimes understanding is up here. We're very much alive from the neck up. And I also needed to reconnect with the body and with the earth. So at some point I dropped out of my first PhD in theology and I went to drama school and I studied physical theatre. And it was a way for me to put into practice a lot of the things I had called into question, a lot of the things I had deconstructed, a lot of the things I had thought about in an intellectual way, but I brought it to the body. And it was a way to really live it out and experience things in a way that was felt, or that was sensorial, and not simply abstract, not simply with concepts and ideas. And then I trained as a psychotherapist, and on the way in various communication tools and as a conflict mediator, nonviolent communication, authentic relating, and other such disciplines or related disciplines. And it's funny because I posted an article today on LinkedIn comparing the role of the priest and that of the psychotherapist, because they're very much related, in my opinion. Both are called to serve, and ministry just means service. And that's what therapy means as well, to attend to something or someone. And I like to remind people of the etymology of the term psychotherapy, and it means the care of the soul. Psyche in Greek is not just the mind, it's the soul. It's much deeper than that. So it's not simply about fixing problems and just getting on with life. I see psychotherapy as a way to really question things. Your relationship to reality, to other people, your place within society, within the world. Finding ways to be at home with and in the world. And I suppose a lot of people that would have gone to see a priest for spiritual counsel in the past now go to see therapists, because that's where they can really open up. That's where they can be really vulnerable. That's one space in which they can be themselves. I work a lot with groups, because to me, it's not just a one-on-one relationship between the therapist and the client, but we can all learn from each other. And having people act as mirrors and as witnesses to your experience, and realize actually it's a shared experience and it's not just your story, and your story relates to a broader story. And we're all human. We all have these basic needs. We all have, similar experiences of the world after all. That's a very empowering experience. So for the past few years, or for my whole life in a way, what I've been doing is I've been creating spaces of inspiration and empowerment. Safer spaces, as they're called sometimes. Places where people feel safe enough to say, oh, okay, I can be a little more vulnerable. I can explore. I'm inspired to try new things. I'm empowered to try new things, to do things differently. Because the way in which we do things, and what we take for granted, that's just one way. That's what is considered to be right at one time in one place. We all know that 100 years ago it was different. In 100 years' time it will be different. In other cultures and societies it'll be different. It is different. But it's not just how we dress or how we eat. It's also how we interact. It's also what we feel. It's also how we understand the world. And so I work as a psychotherapist and coach, consultant, and I am the director of an organization that I founded called the Institute of Devotional Arts. And we work mainly with expressive art therapy. That is, you could say, the performing arts aspect of art therapy, although it's not about performance, as I'm sure you know. It's about working with the body as the only instrument necessary, people's stories as the only plot needed, and our imagination as the means to connect the story and the body.
Dr. Dao, you mentioned earlier that the two things from your perspective, the two things that get in the way of effective communication are vulnerability and conflict, or our fear of vulnerability and conflict. And I was thinking about this, about how, conflict, even the word, you feel something. I feel something in my body when I say the word conflict. And it's such an uncomfortable thing, but it's such a big part of our lives. We deal with it every day. We ignore it a lot of the times, right? We avoid it, but it's present everywhere. Anytime you're interacting with other people, I feel like there's potential for conflict. You're bringing what you're bringing, they're bringing what they're bringing, and you have to figure out this like dance of how do I work with this new person? How do I speak with them? How do I communicate with them? How do I get my needs known and met and heard? And how do I, reciprocate that? This is especially, I think, relevant in the workplace where there's now this kind of environment in which you have to like play nice, quote unquote, right? Everyone has to kind of get along to get the work done. And it's really hard, I think, it's really hard to stay calm when we feel like we're under attack, which can happen a lot. What are some of the most common patterns that you see in how people deal with conflict, or maybe not deal with conflict? And what needs to shift in our mindset to be able to deal with conflict more skillfully?
I like the fact that you use the word dance, how we have to navigate those uncomfortable situations. So my question is, are people really dancing and engaging with the dance and enjoying the dance? Or are they being sort of on the fringes of the dance floor and not really stepping in? So my invitation would be to fully embrace it, to welcome it, and to reframe conflict not as failure, but as a way to better understand each other and to grow together. First, conflict is unavoidable. It will happen, no matter what. Otherwise, life would be boring. If we were to agree on everything, we wouldn't move forwards. So we should develop a little more of that, or the entrepreneurial mindset, iteration, failing. And that's how you learn, that's how you grow. In this case, we don't need to do much. We just need to let it happen, because it will, no matter what. Unless you don't speak to anyone, or maybe you'll be in conflict with yourself. And that's a whole other thing. Also very present.
Yeah, that's your next episode that you're going to come talk about.
Yeah. But so the first step I would say is simply realizing that it'll happen. There's no point trying to avoid it. It's like trying to avoid the rain. Well, it's good if it rains. It's necessary, it's needed, it's unavoidable. Otherwise, there wouldn't be life. Second step, as I said, is not to see it as failure. Yes, it is uncomfortable, but there are lots of things that are good for you and that are uncomfortable. Exercising, eating certain foods that may be healthy but not necessarily palatable, and so on and so forth. And seeing it in a positive light. Okay, I'm noticing tension, discomfort. There is friction. How can I use that, not necessarily to my advantage? How can I use that to better understand the other person and to grow together? Now, it's easier said than done. You say, okay, but in practice, how does that work? Especially if the other person is not doing that. Well, I think people agree a lot more than they think. And people have a lot more shared goals than it's sometimes assumed. So assuming positive intent is a good first step. They're not trying to do bad things. They're not trying to blame me. They're not trying to take advantage of me, or maybe not fully consciously. And sometimes they might, but at least assuming that everyone is better off if everyone is happy. And overall, they're trying their best, and you are too. So assuming positive intent would be a first step. And also finding basic common ground by stating the facts, things that cannot be denied. And that's the first step of nonviolent communication, observation. And it's also harder to do than one may think, of course, of stating the facts. Simple, simple. But actually, oftentimes there's a lot of judgment or unnecessary generalizations. You always do this. You never do that. It's hundreds of times you've said that. And so generic, vague statements about what the person did. But if you say, last Sunday, when we started a meeting, probably not on Sunday, hopefully not, last Monday morning, when we had the meeting at 9 p.m., and you said this, and you repeat what, the closest thing, what you can remember from what they said, well, this happened. And if it's accurate, so this is neither positive nor negative, it's just an observation, then they're bound to acquiesce. So you already have a yes. You already found basic common ground. Okay, we agree, this is what happened. And it also means you observed what happened. You were attentive, you were present, and they agree. So that's a great first step. And then the second step, and that's also the second step of nonviolent communication, which is a 4-step process, is something that's a little less common. First stage, just starting with the facts is not all that common. All of a sudden, we want something. We go straight to, why did you do this? And it's to express how you feel. And here you may think, oh, that's also easier said than done. I'm working. I'm not going to start sitting down with my boss or colleague and say, yes, I have been feeling a little sad lately. Because no, you don't need to open up to that extent if you just had a little problem with a colleague. And one way of doing that, depending on your relationship with your colleague and how you're feeling at work and how much you want to open up, it could be 1, 2, maximum 3 feelings. And if there's conflict most of the time, the main feelings, if you want to make it something more, if you want to make it a little more generic, is discomfort, uneasiness. Now, I feel a little bit uneasy. I felt, quite uncomfortable with that. And speaking about yourself first, people tend to, a common mistake, if I may call it that, in communication, is talking about the other person. You did this, you. Using I statements, speaking from the first person. I feel this way. This is the impact it had on me. So this is what happened, and this is how I feel. So just these two steps, and seeing how the person reacts, that already makes a tremendous difference, because people are not used to communicating in this way. There are extra steps which I'm happy to discuss, but you also don't want to overwhelm people with,
Yeah.
a whole discourse about how you feel, what's happened. Okay, two, 3 sentences. Monday morning at 9 a.m. when the meeting started, you told me X, Y, Z. I felt a bit uncomfortable. Pause, see what happens. Just there.
Yeah.
How is that landing with you, Sarah? Does that seem realistic?
Honestly, no.
Yeah,
And here's why.
please.
I wish this was realistic. And I'm familiar with the nonviolent communication framework. I love it. I love the way you describe it. But I think my next question is this. How do you, as someone who is the person on the other side of that, receiving that, someone's sitting there with you going, hey, on Monday morning, you said this. Immediately, right? I think what tends to happen is defenses come up, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this person's gonna say something that's gonna not make me feel good, or they're gonna blame me for something. And I can see people either denying it or immediately feeling like they have to protect themselves. So maybe we should talk about how you, as a recipient of that information, how might we change our approach so that we're just more open to that feedback. I don't know if that's the right question. If there's a better question to be asking, let me know.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think it's important to step back, as you say. I'm not suggesting just approaching someone out of the blue and saying, hey, on Monday morning, this is what happened. I feel uncomfortable. People will definitely be taken aback. So to put things into context, I'd ask the person if they're ready to receive feedback, or you have something to share with them. So you don't want to take them off guard.
Okay.
So, do you have a moment? Maybe in a more informal context, coffee break. So asking them if they're available and making sure they are, that they're not just trying to be nice. Oh, yeah, saying, can we take 5 minutes? Being extra clear. Can you take 5 minutes? You can even already say, I just felt a little uncomfortable with something earlier on. Are you available for me to share that? And you can even emphasize, if you're not, it's totally fine. So that you give them the opportunity to say no, so that they don't feel pressured to then receive feedback. So that would be helpful. And yes, it is also helpful to work on yourself as a recipient, but in a way that's too easy, because that makes the problem go away. Because usually, if you are trying to improve your ways to communicate as an interlocutor, you will also improve your ways to listen. And listening is one of the first steps in improving communication. And so what is challenging, more often than not, is that you are working on improving your communication skills with people who may not necessarily be aligned, or who may not be doing the same thing. So they may actually be put off by some of the things you say because they don't have that shared language of needs, feelings, boundaries, and so on. So I'd say it's more useful to actually train with people who are not used to it, or pretending that people are not used to it, because most people aren't. So it's too easy to say, okay, now I'm in the recipient's shoes. How would I then respond well to someone who approaches me and asks me, oh, do you have 5 minutes? I have something to share, something maybe a little comfortable. So that I would say is even less realistic, because most of the time, the situations people are in are situations where actually the people they're with, their interlocutors, do not go that extra mile, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I did not think about it from that perspective. Thank you for that clarification. I'm curious, you do this work with organizations, right? How would walk us through what a group activity that leverages this framework, what might that look like?
Well, first we start from the problem, right? So it's good to start with the problems. Some are apparent, some not as much. So we all have the tendency to want to say things even when the other person is speaking. Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, all the time, yes.
Yes. So the person is speaking, and in your mind you think, oh, and even your body language sometimes even signals it quite clearly, because you're leaning in, and even what I'm doing now with my hand, I don't know if this is being filmed.
Yeah.
And the person even feels it, and you feel like you even stop breathing sometimes. Or even if you're having a more comfortable conversation, sometimes you're elsewhere. You're thinking about something totally different, and then you go blank for a moment, and you try to catch up, and kind of like when you're reading. and you've just skipped pages, and then you turn the page back. Actually, what just happened? I have no idea.
Yeah.
So lack of presence, attention, listening. And that's also simple and that can be developed. If there is never any pauses in an interaction, and also that's quite cultural. Some cultures are much more comfortable with silence and pauses. So I'm in Sweden now, and some of my friends were telling me about Swedish culture, and they were saying that they don't tend to speak as much as in other cultures. And sometimes they go have coffee and they sit together, even if they're friends or a couple, in silence, and that's fine. In other cultures, you're constantly chit-chatting. If you're from, I also lived in Spain and South America, lively culture in which it would be awkward not to speak. So I'm not saying we need to be in total silence for 2 minutes, but there's this fraction of a second when someone is done speaking and you really know that they're done because they're just silent, they're stopped. Instead of, basically, we're constantly interrupting each other. So sometimes it's just a lively conversation and it's totally fine, and one is adding something, but sometimes the person really wants to finish what they have to say, and sometimes they want to take 2 seconds in silence, but they're not even allowed to do so because as soon as they do that, someone jumps in and interrupts them. And that's really common in meetings. How often is there a meeting where we can just listen to someone, unless they're the boss, pause just for a few seconds without being interrupted and letting them continue their thought? Rarely. So pointing out all of the things that could be improved in communication, such as, listening skills, allowing ourselves to pause, that would be the first step. Then going through practical exercises. Basically, my aim is, not an aim, but my approach is that if there's to be theory and conceptual understanding and analysis, it comes after practice. Usually it's the other way around. There's a lot of theory, this is what we're going to do, long PowerPoint presentation, and then we do 5 minutes of practice. Or in between, we do like short exercises. I do it the other way around. Because life is not a theory. Life is practice. And that's what we need most. And we learn best by doing, practicing. So lots of practical exercises. And then from the exercises, making people realize what they do, what they don't do already. Starting with what's there, rather than me coming with, this is how we communicate, and this is how we should communicate. These are the mistakes you're making. I don't know. Maybe in that company, in that organization, they have really good listening skills for whatever reason. So maybe that's not something to emphasize. So starting with what's present, with practical exercises, and then deducing from the exercises what is needed. But oftentimes there are similarities, and we could all do with a little more listening. Other exercises that we practice involve saying things we wouldn't usually say. That can be quite uncomfortable at first. And so also trying to see how much discomfort we can tolerate and how far we're willing to venture out of our comfort zone. This is the learning zone. We don't want to go to the panic zone where what's happening. I am sharing all sorts of things about my personal life I would never have shared. So we don't necessarily want to go there. But if we're just communicating as always, just realizing, oh yeah, we could do with a little bit more listening. And if I just tell you, we could do with a little bit more listening, that will not change anything. So really practical embodied exercises. And there are a number of games that can be played, exercises that can be practiced. One in the group is called circling. As the name indicates, we're in a circle. And here, I mentioned earlier on pausing. And I was talking recently with Ted Rao, who's the founder of Sociocracy for All. Sociocracy is a method of horizontal management for organizations. And he reminded me of the power of rounds, meaning just one person speaks after the other, uninterrupted. Maybe just for 1 minute, maybe until they're done for a period of time. And how this is actually really rare or never practiced in our society. So just having a moment. Everyone has a minute. You need not speak. You can stay 20 seconds in silence, say a few words, start speaking again. A practice that seems to be as basic as that can be extremely powerful. And actually, when I coach couples sometimes, or friends or communities, if there is one practice that I recommend, which is extremely simple, it's that one person speaks for 5 minutes, uninterrupted. No questions, no comments. The other person does the same. That's it. End of the story. You do that once a week with your community, with your organization, with your partner, it will already make a huge difference. The second step, if there is to be one, and that's found in all communication methodologies, it's to reflect back what you heard, to rephrase what the person said. And that may also seem a little stupid and basic and simple, but it's extremely effective. And it's effective for everyone. It's effective because it forces you to listen. If you think, I'm going to have to repeat what the person said, you have to listen. You're listening more attentively for sure. Not just listening, you have to try to understand. It's not just, you're not memorizing what the person is saying. That's not how the mind works. So you have to listen, you have to understand, and by understanding, you develop empathy, and the person feels heard. So you're already bonding and connecting a lot more. And you may just rephrase what they said with the exact same words or with your own words. And you may be asking a few questions at the end. That would be an extra step. Okay, this is what happened. This is what you felt. I imagine this is what you need, or imagine you must feel this way. Is that right? Or ask further questions. Usually people start there. Oh, what about this? And they also ask questions about things that they are interested in. Someone is sharing a story and like, oh yeah, what happened then? Well, what about your mother? Was she there? But that's not really what you want to share. So making the conversation more about the other person and why they're speaking, what their need is. So in a democratic school I worked in, democratic schools are, it's a version of alternative education like Montessori, Waldorf schools, but it's a little more radical. And they were asking children three things. Do you want to be helped? Do you want to be heard? Or do you want to be hugged? Why are you coming to see me? Why are we speaking? Sometimes you just want to be heard. You don't want comments, questions. You don't want a solution. And many people are solution oriented. They really want to help. They want to do good. How about this? Have you tried that? Sometimes that's not what people need. Sometimes they just need to speak, which is why they go see therapists. They don't try to help them, or they help them in a different way. They just need to be heard. That's it. Or sometimes they do want to be helped. They do want suggestions. And sometimes they need physical presence. They need to be hugged, or just someone present with them. So also getting clear when you're speaking, why am I speaking? Am I speaking so that I just have to say something and I just don't want people to react? I just want to put it out there. Do I want reactions and people to suggest things and provide advice? Or do I want to share it but also feel the person's presence for them to hold me in that moment? Yeah. So I feel like I'm getting sidetracked a bit. What was the original question now?
No,
oh yes, the exercises. That's right. And but please do ask me questions, and I can describe circling a little more in a moment.
No, this is amazing. I want to sum up a couple of things that I heard here were active listening. So practicing that active listening, reflecting back. I have a question about that I'm leading up to. And then I love I always talk about how I think it's very important to state your intention sometimes before you start talking. It's almost like I'm going to say something, but I'm leading up to a question, or like that, help. Do you want to be helped? Do you want to be heard, or do you want to be hugged? Sometimes I'll go to a friend and I'll ask, hey, do you have the emotional capacity right now for us to have a conversation that's really heavy? And then I'll let them know, what I would really like is just for you to listen, or what I would really like is for some advice here. And I think that's really powerful to frame a conversation. So I love that. Do you want to be held, or hugged, heard? Helped, heard, or hugged. I like that. Yeah. My question to you is, you mentioned this a little while ago about there are certain cultures where it's very normal to interrupt, speak over each other, And I know here in the United States, like that's very, that's frowned upon, especially in the workplace, especially in meetings. We can't help it. I've actually been in an interesting situation where I've given this feedback to someone who kept kind of interrupting in meetings, not me. But I was noticing this pattern and I was like, well, I shared this feedback with her and she said, well, the country that I come from, my home, this is how we communicate and this is how we show people that we're listening. Because if you just sat there and didn't say anything, in my head, I would be like, is this person even listening? Are they even listening to me? So how do you honor the cultural differences that exist in these communities and these spaces while also being a good listener and practicing something like active listening?
Thank you for raising that point. I mean, cultural sensitivity is crucial. So at least two things. One is that there's bound to be a shared company culture, organizational culture. There are expectations and there are ways in which we do things collectively that are aligned, that are somewhat homogenous, whether or not we want it. That's what we do as social creatures. So even though she communicated differently, I imagine she still didn't communicate in the same way as she would with her relatives or whoever she would interact in this way with. Maybe it would be slightly more like the company or the organization communicated. I would start by having everyone share what their communication styles are, so we get a sense of where people are coming from. Because she knew that. She could have said, or maybe she did not, but it would be a way for people to reflect about, how do I communicate? What am I used to? So having just a little moment to get to know your colleagues or your friends, or if you are working with people, saying, okay, well, it requires a certain amount of self-awareness, but that's a great first step. And so you were asking, what do I bring to organizations, to groups, to teams? And so starting from what's there, but also the apparent, but the things that are not so apparent. Actually, I realized it was very normal growing up for us to interrupt each other all the time, and it wasn't considered impolite. That was just a way in which we showed that we listened, just like you said. So where are we starting from? Where are we coming from? What's our background? How do we communicate? That's one. Two is, what is the shared vocabulary we want to have? Even though there will always be slight differences, there should still be, we agree that if we shake hands, it means hello. Even though when you were in the culture in which you're raised, you bow. But you still know that you probably wouldn't do that because that's not what we do here. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other, it's just different. So getting a sense of what are the criteria or the styles of communication we want to use. So basically having a collective agreement as to how we want to communicate. Yeah. So those two steps, I think, would be a very good start.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing some of those best practices. I agree. I think what you're speaking to here is bringing that intentionality into the workplace, and I think that gets missed a lot. I think people do gather a lot, assuming we make a lot of assumptions when we walk into the workplace, and I don't know if enough leaders or HR teams or organizations as wholes are taking the time to really understand who's in the room, what their preferences are, what their style of communication or collaboration is. So I think that's really important.
And people spend quite a lot of time sometimes, defining values and goals. And that's great. But where are we starting from? And what are the things that need to be adjusted so that we can better know each other and understand each other? Not just in terms of productivity and skill sets, but also human qualities.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I love that you brought that up because I do think we spend almost like way too much time talking about roadmaps and priorities and projects that we're going to take on this quarter or next quarter and what are the company's goals, and those are all really important things. But like that starting point is, how are we existing together in this space?
And if people are thriving within the organization will run in a smoother way. And it's a win-win-win.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's not something that should be overlooked.
Yeah. I have one question that might be kind of a gnarly one for us to unpack. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this. When it comes to boundaries, I have had experiences in the workplace where this idea of boundaries has maybe been misunderstood or maybe just understood differently, and almost it feels like it's been weaponized, where it's like people sometimes will go, I can't have this conversation. It's like this excuse to like disengage. This is a personal experience I had with a colleague. I had started a project. I got called in on a project and it was very like last minute, and I was just trying to gather information. And this individual was being very, over Slack, being what I felt was like not very collaborative. And so I messaged him one night and I was like, hey, I just want to let you know, I think, maybe we should get on a call and talk about this because I want to help. I want to be a good partner to you, but it feels like I'm not being heard in these conversations, in these meetings. And he immediately responded. We now have a beautiful relationship, but he responded immediately with like, well, I'm just trying to set boundaries because we all need that. And he immediately disengaged, and we did eventually have a conversation about it, and we ended up having a great working relationship. But that's not an uncommon experience from what I gather, because I did talk to a few friends about it. My friends were like, yeah, people do that all the time now, where if they don't want to deal with something, they're just like, this is my boundary. How can we set boundaries while also, I guess, doing it in a respectful way, in a way that doesn't burn bridges and doesn't hurt other people?
Yes, boundaries are important, and it's something we're learning how to honor setting boundaries. But as you pointed out, it can be done in a way that is more divisive than productive. And behind a boundary, there's always a need. There's always a story. And so I think it's about encouraging the person, or inviting the person rather, to share a little more as to why they're setting that boundary. Where they're coming from. And I wonder, in this case, you said you now have a beautiful relationship. How did you go about addressing that issue and confronting him about that? Would you be happy to tell me a little more?
Yeah, I think I did exactly that, where I was like, okay, well, I'd like to understand a little bit more about where this is coming from. And again, let's do it in a way that you feel comfortable. And then we ended up getting on a call, and we realized we had so many shared goals, and it was going to be really fun to work together on them.
Well, then you know the answer already. See, that's what I was saying earlier on. I think we have a lot more shared goals than we realize. Not just goals, also needs. We're all humans. We all want to be respected. We all want to be cared for. We all want to be listened to, and so on and so forth. Actually, when you get to the need level, oftentimes people realize there aren't that many disagreements. Sometimes we have the same need, that same unmet need. And so what started as conflict, actually as divergence, ends up in convergence. Because you realize, oh, actually, yeah, I also felt disrespected. I also want to be respected. I also felt hurt. We just interpreted the situation in different ways. And we were coming from different places. So putting things into context and showing empathy, what you just did to me is a sign or gesture of empathy. When you try to understand the other person without judgment, which can be difficult to do, especially if you don't want to be in a reactive state. What I was saying at the start, assume positive intent. If they are trying to protect themselves, and that's why people set boundaries, there's a reason for that. If there's a no to something, if they're saying no to something, what are they saying yes to? And what they're saying yes to is their need. What is their need? Yeah.
I could talk to you about communication forever. Thank you so much. This was such a rich conversation, and I really appreciate you being here. I would love to have you share with our audience. You do such cool work with organizations, with individuals. I'll drop all your information for your website and LinkedIn in the show notes. But if people want to work with you, what are some of the things that they can look forward to working with you on, and how can they get in touch with you?
Thank you for asking, Sarah. They can look up Institute of Devotional Arts. Devotionalarts.org is the website. They can find me easily on LinkedIn. I'm Dr. Swan Dao. I post on there regularly. Those are the best ways to reach out. And we work a lot with embodied tools, as I was saying. Practice makes perfect. And it is about not just understanding what's happening, but understanding in the body. And if I may just add one quick tip, which is oftentimes overlooked. We say a lot of communication is nonverbal. And there are different studies on this, and some tell you up to 90% or 70%. Well, not quite. If you still just say, if you are talking nonsense, then this is 100% what people will get, even if you have great body language. That being said, body language is essential, but also people neglect also tone of voice and how you say things. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And something can be interpreted and received in radically different ways based on how you say things. And so when I said one of the simple things to do is to reflect back what the person is saying. It's not simply trying to understand intellectually. It could even be imitating the body posture or noticing it, even saying it out loud, saying, oh, I notice your hands are moving a lot. Is that because you're feeling a little stressed or something? And if you yourself adopt the same posture, you will feel some of the things that the other person is feeling. So improving communication is really just being more tuned to a lot of things in the room, in the space, in the other person. It's not simply understanding the content of what they're saying. So even though listening is key, it's not simply listening to the words, it's everything that's behind the words. And sometimes that's just as crucial, if not more significant, than what's actually being said. So yes, as I said, connect with me on LinkedIn, Dr. Swan Dao. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Sarah. Thank you so much for your invitation.